It was taking me so long to get around to these movies that, to be honest, I began to fear I wasn't going to watch them at all. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel. Today we're talking about a few films from last month, all three movies in the Fear Street Trilogy. Before we begin, let me know in the comments what your thoughts on these movies were, if you already saw them or if you're planning on seeing them, and make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these reviews, as it helps me out immensely by getting my channel out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with reviews of new releases, older films, hidden gems, and so much more on a near daily basis. But let's jump right into it and let's talk about the Fear Street Trilogy. All three films in the Fear Street Trilogy were directed by Leigh Janiak, who also co-wrote each film with a different screenwriter, and they're all based on the R.L. Stine book series of the same name. Now, if you follow my channel, you know I normally do an individual video for each movie I discuss. But with this, I will break my rules slightly. I will be discussing and rating each film separately, but I'm already late to discussing these films, and considering all three of them are tightly linked to one another, and they were released one right after the other, and you don't get a properly satisfying experience unless you watch all three of them, it just makes sense to do all of this in one shot. Really, if anything, given all those factors I mentioned, these feel more like 3 extended episodes of a miniseries rather than 3 movies. But I've never read any of the Fear Street books, as my only exposure to R.L. Stine's work was reading the original Goosebumps series growing up, and that's it. Though what I do know is, while Goosebumps is geared towards younger audiences, Fear Street was geared more towards teenagers, and I'd say that's who these 3 movies were mainly geared towards as well, especially considering all 3 have a focus on teenage protagonists. Though while I do have good things to say about each of them, I did also get the sense that sometimes they didn't always just try to appeal to teenagers. All 3 were R-rated, and some of the graphic violence and mature themes seem to indicate they were also trying to cater towards adults as well, mainly those who grew up on reading the original books. Though because of that, it led to some tonal issues overall, as in each film, all to varying degrees, one minute we get this absolutely brutal death scene, but then the next we get all this bickering and arguing that was in the vein of a CW show, and it would come off as just so jarring when going from scene to scene. But let's get into each of them individually and talk about them a little more in depth. And these won't be overly long, but since I'm discussing all 3 movies at once, and they each pick up right where the last one left off, I'm pretty much going to get into some spoilers for all 3 films. I'm not going to go through every single plot detail, but if you wish to know absolutely nothing about any of these movies, go watch them and then come back to this, as this is your spoiler warning. But anyway, here we go. Part 1, 1994, focuses on a circle of teenage friends who accidentally encounter the ancient evil responsible for a series of brutal murders that have plagued their town for over 300 years. Our main characters for this one are led by Kiana Madeira as Dina, Olivia Scott Welch as her ex-girlfriend Sam, and Benjamin Flores Jr. as Dina's true crime-obsessed brother Josh, who begin to investigate the curse of a witch named Sarah Fear, which they believe has haunted the town of Shadyside since she was killed in 1666. Now, I'd say of all 3 movies in this trilogy, this would be the one that will probably connect most with viewers. As I mentioned, the target audience for these movies seems to be 90s kids who grew up reading a lot of R.L. Stine's works. Plus, it also lifts a lot of influences from slasher films that were popular at the time, in particular Scream. The opening scene, taking place in an empty bookstore featuring Maya Hawke being taunted over the phone by a murderous stalker, is reminiscent of Drew Barrymore's appearance in Scream. Plus, Benjamin Flores Jr.'s character is obsessed with true crime, the same way Jamie Kennedy is obsessed with horror movie rules in Scream. It takes place in a small town and focuses on a group of teenage protagonists, which can really fall under any number of horror movies, but when you add everything up, it clearly gives off the feel of Scream. Or to an extent, I Know What You Did Last Summer. And for a lot of its stylistic influences, I think that will be what makes it click for so many viewers. Nostalgia can be a powerful thing, and as someone who grew up in the 90s, I can assure you that people who also grew up at that time really do have a lot of nostalgia for this time period in particular. And for what it's worth, it is cool to see, and I did like the visual aesthetic overall, with its heavy use of neon lighting and having most scenes just bursting with color. Though as for the rest of the movie, well, it's still pretty good. I do think that maybe the film wears its influences too much on its sleeve at times, and it has these characters go through pretty familiar feeling arcs without much substance otherwise. Like, I never really felt as if there was much to these characters beyond how much they compared to other characters from other movies. Some of the supporting characters were given very little to do and truthfully felt a bit disposable, while some of the main characters weren't as interesting as the personal conflicts they were going through. Like, for example, there was a lot of tension between Dina and Sam throughout the film, as Sam was still in the closet and started dating a guy, and it caused Dina to be humiliated, and that causes them to argue a lot all throughout this. But a lot of it felt pretty surface level, and I was never given much else of a reason to care for either of them otherwise, and we really don't learn much else about them otherwise, just who they are in relation to this curse. So I would have liked had they not just hit the same few notes over and over again. But what it lacks in its story elements, it at least makes up for in being a fun slasher movie. As I mentioned earlier, all these movies are considerably bloodier than you think they would be. And there'd also be these tense standoffs and chase sequences between our lead characters and these mysterious killers that would feel pretty gripping. I think the fact that Janiak also added a lot of solid visual flair, like with the aforementioned neon lighting and some stylish camera angles, really added to the excitement of these scenes. Plus, you do have this intriguing mystery at the heart of it, as this curse placed on this town involves these killers who seemingly keep coming back no matter what's done to them. So I thought that was something really cool to keep us invested. I just think that whenever it wasn't focused on these graphically violent moments, it wasn't quite as strong. It would occasionally get a good laugh out of me here and there through some of the humorous interactions among all the friends, but as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the bickering and melodrama among some of the characters, in particular Dina and Sam, felt considerably watered down compared to the mystery and serial killer elements. It felt like a soap opera, and what didn't help either was that some of the acting wasn't all that great either. In particular, I found Kiana Madeira to be very hit and miss. But for what it was, I had fun with it. I liked its tributes to other horror movies of the era, its overall visual aesthetic, and its exciting, action-driven moments. And while it might have been inconsistent, there was still enough for me to be engaged. Fear Street Part 1, 1994 gets a 7 out of 10. Part 2, 1978, takes place at Shadyside's Camp Nightwing, where summer activities are about to begin. But when another Shadysider is possessed with the urge to kill, the fun in the sun becomes a gruesome fight for survival. While the main focus of this one does take place in the 70s, there is also a framing device featuring our characters from the first film. At the end of 1994, Sam winds up possessed by Sarah Fear, and Dina and Josh bring her to a woman simply known as C. Berman, played by Gillian Jacobs, who died from the witch's attacks in 1978 but was resuscitated, and the rest of the film is her recounting the events of that day, focusing on a young C. Berman known as Ziggy as our protagonist, and now played by Sadie Sink. This one is very clearly influenced by Friday the 13th, with the summer camp setting and the nasty camp counselors being reminiscent of Camp Crystal Lake and its counselors. And while the Friday the 13th movies might not have quite as big of a connection with the film's target audience as Scream did, I mean, we are still talking about one of the most popular slasher franchises of all time, and I do think people will still appreciate the stylistic influences here. In addition to Sadie Sink as Ziggy, our other main characters include Emily Rudd as Ziggy's sister Cindy and Ryan Simpkins as a counselor named Alice. And we do get just a little bit of backstory into some of Shadyside's history and how everyone is connected to the 1994 sequences. Like one of the characters here, Nurse Lane, is the mother of Ruby Lane, who was one of the killers brought back from the dead in the 1994 sequences. And I'd say in general, this did a little bit of a better job with its characters than Part 1 did. Not to say that this is the most character-driven film, as we still only learn so much about each of them, and I think the way it splits its time among multiple storylines could have been a little better. In particular, Ziggy's role in the first half of the film felt slightly aimless to me, and you don't really feel her relevance to the story until later on. But I do think in general, the characters are considerably more likable than the first film, and it did a better job of not making everyone feel quite disposable. Even if they only had a little bit of screen time, they either played a relevant enough part in the current story or the bigger picture, so that was cool. I was especially caught off guard as there was one character who, for the first part of the film, felt very detached from what was going on, and I assumed as a result they were just getting set up to get quickly killed off. Yet this character wound up actually having one of the most relevant parts to the entire movie, and it wasn't done in this way where it comes off as totally forced, so that was cool. And I think the acting all around was much better here than in 1994. Sadie Sink is just fantastic here, and well within her comfort zone, given she's a regular on Stranger Things. But while I'm not familiar with either Emily Rudd or Ryan Simpkins, they both did really solid jobs as well, as did Jordan Spiro as Nurse Lane, who is very close with Ziggy. Now, there was still some of that corny melodrama that we saw from the first movie, but a lot of the arguing among everyone didn't feel so hokey, and I was able to buy a lot of the relationships among the characters much better here, and it was easier to get invested in them. I think of all three movies, this had the most consistent tone in the entire series. There were still some issues here and there when it came to how the action scenes felt versus how the dialogue-driven scenes felt, and I do think that some of the character arcs, while fine for the most part, could have been fleshed out in a few areas. But I found this to be entertaining. It once again felt very exciting, the performances were solid all around, and there was more to the story to get you hooked in, so I thought this was another solid entry overall. Fear Street Part 2, 1978 gets a 7 out of 10. Part 3, 1666, explores the origins of Sarah Fear's curse, as history comes full circle on a night that changes the lives of Shadysiders forever. So this one's actually a little misleading, as the actual 1666 part of this film only takes up the first half, while 1994 is less of a framing device here, and it's actually the focus of the entire second half of the movie. The stylistic influences are a little less overt here than in the other two movies, though Janiak has said in an interview that this is stylistically similar to Terrence Malick's The New World, which was an interesting comparison to make. I mean, probably not too many people have seen or even heard of that one, to be quite honest. It's not a horror movie, and it was interesting they decided to go for the feel of a Terrence Malick movie rather than other films that would feel similar to either Friday the 13th or Scream. What I will say is, I saw The New World once and I barely remember it, so there's that. But while the 1666 part of the film does technically focus on an entirely different set of characters, catch is that it's presented as a vision of Dina's, and she sees both herself and her friends and family in the roles of these past figures. Dina herself is Sarah Fear, Dina's brother Josh is now Sarah's brother Henry, Sam is now the town pastor's daughter Hannah, Cindy and Ziggy from the second film return as two sisters named Abigail and Constance, and so on. Now, I've had my issues with each of these movies. This one had the most prevalent issues. For one thing, the 1666 part of this film just didn't grab me. I think part of it simply has to do with the fact that I'm not really big into older period pieces like this, which I know may not be an issue for everyone, but even if it's within the context of a horror movie, it's still gotta do something really special to truly grab me. And I gotta be honest, I just didn't feel like that was the case here, as it was so exposition heavy and some of these dialogue driven moments go on for way too long. And while all these movies are close to 2 hours, this is the first time you actually feel it a bit, and it's because of the actual 1666 part of the film. I get that we're trying to bring everything full circle and lay all the groundwork for this finale, but it just wasn't doing anything for me. And what didn't help either was that all the characters here speak in these god-awful Irish accents. Like, I try to avoid discussing how actors speak in movies, as I don't want to come off like I'm making fun of how anyone sounds, and I know this isn't really all their fault, but the decision to have them speak in these very unconvincing accents was a bad one, and it would constantly take me out of the moment anytime they spoke. Now, if I had anything positive to say, beyond it did a good job establishing the witch's curse, it's that it at least remains consistent in terms of style with the other two movies. There were some cool looking haunting shots, as well as some sequences that gave off a bit of a hypnotic quality. And one thing all three movies did, which I liked every time it was done, would be that it would contain this one sequence where a number of characters are either being questioned about this one subject, or they're just giving their thoughts on something. And the way it would be done would be the static shot, and we cycle through a number of characters, cutting quickly between each of their stories and hearing their differing takes, and we go in and out between each of their stories. We see it with some of the high school students in the first film, we see it with the campers in the second, and in this film, we see it with some of the townspeople. So that was cool. Though I'd say once it established the origins of this curse and we move things back to 1994, this got a lot better. It still suffered from some of the same issues that plagued the first movie, like some of the stiff acting and tonal inconsistencies, since it was focused on all those same characters once again, but it at least went back to feeling fun. We get back to that teen slasher feel in the vein of Scream like the first movie. There were a few moments that showed off the series' dark sense of humor, the showdown between our heroes and these creatures were really well done, and it gives everyone a satisfying conclusion to all their arcs. And because this takes up about half the runtime on its own, it's able to make up for the very bloated first half a lot. It isn't like we only spend 15 to 20 minutes back in 1994, and everything else is just in the past. So because of that, it allows this trilogy to end on a solid enough note, even if the film as a whole isn't quite as strong. Fear Street Part 3, 1666 gets a 6.5 out of 10. So, if I had to rank these movies, I'd go with 1666 in third place, 1994 in second, and just inching it out in first place is 1978. And I'd say between 1994 and 1978, it was a little close. But for the most part, all three movies were pretty solid. While they might not have been the most consistent films, they all had a nice throwback aesthetic to them, with plenty of tributes to classic horror movies, and a cool mystery at the heart of them. So in the end, I had a good time. And I do know Lee Janiak has mentioned she wants to continue the series and make it an entire universe, and that would be cool if Netflix decides to go forward with it, but we'll have to wait and see. Let me know though, did you see the entire Fear Street trilogy, or are you planning to see it, and what were your thoughts? Did you agree with my ranking? Do you want to see more films in this universe? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it, and for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching everyone, and keep having fun with film.